It all started with a nagging feeling I had ignored for far too long. My name is David, and I once thought that marrying Sophia was the best decision I'd ever made. She was charming, intelligent, and ambitious. Everything I thought I needed in a partner. But, as they say, love blinds you to the red flags waving furiously in the wind. What I didn't realize back then was that I wasn't just marrying Sophia. I was marrying her entire family. Now, don't get me wrong, I've always believed in family. I grew up in a home where loyalty and mutual respect were the cornerstones of every relationship. My grandfather, a man of simple yet profound wisdom, raised me to value those principles. He used to say, "A house is only as strong as the love within it." When he passed away, he left me his house, a beautiful property with a wraparound porch and a spacious yard. I had planned to start a family there, to build a life with Sophia that was just as strong and warm as the home itself. But instead of building a home together, Sophia brought her family into our lives, and, quite literally, into our house. It started small, with her parents visiting often, staying a few nights here and there. Then it turned into her brother crashing on the couch after losing yet another job. Before I knew it, the house that was supposed to be ours was filled with her family's noise, demands, and entitlement. Sophia's family had a way of making themselves at home, as if they were doing me a favor by gracing my house with their presence. Her father, a retired businessman, loved to offer unsolicited advice about how I should be managing my finances. Her mother treated me like a live-in handyman, constantly pointing out things that needed fixing. And her brother, well, he saw the house as a personal sanctuary where he could avoid adult responsibilities. And Sophia? She didn't just enable their behavior, she defended it. David, their family, she'd say whenever I expressed frustration, "We're supposed to help each other." But help, in my opinion, is a two-way street. What I was doing wasn't helping, it was sacrificing. At first, I swallowed my pride. I told myself this was temporary, that Sophia's family would eventually move on and give us the space to focus on our marriage. But as the years passed, it became clear that they had no intention of leaving. They treated the house as though it belonged to them, and Sophia encouraged it. I tried to make it work. I thought that by being patient and accommodating, I could prove my worth not only to Sophia but to her family as well. Maybe, just maybe, they'd see me as more than the guy who happened to own the roof over their heads. But the more I gave, the less they respected me. I became the invisible man in my own home. And then came the final straw. The betrayal that turned my simmering frustration into a boiling resolve. You see, it wasn't just about being excluded from a trip to Hawaii. It was about the realization that I was never truly part of the family I had tried so hard to embrace. It was about seeing how little my sacrifices meant to them. As I sit here, recounting these moments, I can't help but wonder how I let it get so far. How did I become the man who tiptoed around his own house, afraid to upset people who contributed nothing but criticism and entitlement? How did I become the husband who worked tirelessly to support a wife who prioritized her family, and eventually, her lover, over our marriage? Looking back, the signs were always there. The way Sophia's parents always looked past me during conversations, addressing her as though I didn't exist. The way her brother never offered to contribute to household expenses, treating the place like a free Airbnb. And of course, the way Sophia consistently sided with them, no matter how unreasonable their demands were. I should have said something sooner. I should have drawn a line in the sand before they turned my home into their kingdom. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, isn't it? Now, as I reflect on those years, I can see how I let myself become a doormat. I wanted to be the good husband, the supportive partner who understood the value of family. But I learned the hard way that not all families operate with love and respect. This is where my story begins, not with the betrayal in Hawaii, but with the slow erosion of my self-worth. Because in the end, that's what this is about, reclaiming what I lost. Reclaiming the respect I should have demanded from the start. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. But when you reach a breaking point, when you're pushed so far that you can no longer recognize the person staring back at you in the mirror, something changes. You find a strength you didn't know you had. You realize that sometimes you have to fight not for love, but for yourself. And that's exactly what I did. If there's one thing Sophia's family excelled at, it was theatrics. They could turn the simplest of moments into a grand production, and dinner that night was no exception. The table was set with the kind of care you'd expect for royalty. Candles flickered, the wine glasses sparkled, and Sophia's mother had brought out her best china. I should have known something was brewing. The last time this much effort went into a family dinner, they convinced me to let her brother, Nathan, temporarily move into the guest room. That temporary arrangement, by the way, lasted 2 years. Sophia took her usual place at the head of the table, the unofficial queen of this family monarchy. Her parents sat beside her, her mother already smiling as if she'd won a secret lottery. Nathan slouched in his chair, scrolling through his phone, while I tried not to roll my eyes at the absurdity of it all. Then came the moment. Sophia set her wine glass down with the kind of precision that demanded attention. "David," she said, her voice sweet yet calculated, "we've been thinking about doing something special this Christmas. Something memorable." Her mother leaned in, practically vibrating with excitement. "A trip," she added, her voice full of anticipation. "A trip?" I asked, already bracing myself. "To Hawaii," Sophia announced, her tone dripping with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested this was a done deal, not a proposal. I blinked. "Hawaii," I repeated, as if saying it again would make it sound less ridiculous. "Yes," Sophia exclaimed, leaning forward like a game show host revealing a grand prize. "We could all use a break. The sun, the beaches, the relaxation. It's exactly what we need after this stressful year." Sophia's father nodded, already sold on the idea. "It's perfect. A real family Christmas in paradise." Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't opposed to the idea of a vacation. God knows I could use one. But as someone who works hard to ensure bills are paid and a house is maintained, I couldn't help but wonder who exactly was footing the bill for this tropical escapade. "How much are we talking about here?" I asked cautiously. "Only $3,000 per person," Sophia said, as though that was pocket change. $3,000? I almost choked on my drink. That's quite a bit for a trip." Sophia waved off my concern with a flick of her wrist. "It's worth it, David. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Besides," she added with a pointed smile, "you can afford it, can't you?" There it was. The dig. Sophia had mastered the art of subtle condescension, making sure her words were just sharp enough to sting without drawing blood. I glanced around the table, hoping for some backup, but her parents were too busy nodding in agreement, and Nathan was still glued to his phone. "Well," I began hesitantly, "I'd need to check our budget, but—" "Oh, don't worry about the details," Sophia interrupted, her smile widening. "Just say yes, and I'll take care of the rest." Her mother clapped her hands together like a giddy schoolgirl. "Oh, this is going to be wonderful. We'll all be together, making memories as a family. All together." Those words echoed in my mind. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt like a part of their family. More often than not, I was the outsider, the afterthought. And yet, here they were, asking me to contribute to this grand family adventure as though my role was simply to provide and not to question. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "All right," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll figure it out." Sophia beamed, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this trip would be a turning point. Maybe it would bring us closer together. Maybe, just maybe, I'd finally feel like I belonged. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about bringing the family closer. This was about Sophia getting what she wanted, as always. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside and decided to focus on the positives. A trip to Hawaii sounded nice. After all, who doesn't want to spend Christmas on a beach? What I didn't realize was that the trip wasn't meant for me at all. The signs were there if I'd cared to look. The way Sophia and her mother exchanged knowing glances every time I brought up logistics. The way her father avoided eye contact whenever I mentioned splitting costs. The way Sophia started making subtle comments about how much I worked and how it would be nice for me to have the house to myself for a while. It all came together a few weeks later when Sophia confirmed the booking. "Everything's set," she announced, her voice bright with excitement. "You're going to love it." but as she walked away, I caught something in her tone, a strange edge that made my stomach twist. Something told me this wasn't going to end the way I thought it would. At the time, I brushed it off. I had no idea what was coming. The day of reckoning came just as Christmas approached. The air outside was crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the tropical paradise I thought I'd soon be experiencing. I'd worked tirelessly to scrape together the $3,000 Sophia had requested. Late nights, extra shifts, skipped lunches, it all added up to what I thought was a contribution toward a family vacation. Little did I know, it was the price of betrayal. It started innocently enough. Sophia was bustling around the house, barking orders at Nathan and her parents about what to pack. There were suitcases everywhere, lined up in the hallway, spilling over with clothes, and stacked high with all the essentials for their luxurious getaway. I had my own bag packed, sitting neatly by the front door, complete with a new pair of swim trunks I'd bought specifically for the trip. I walked into the kitchen, where Sophia was busy finalizing plans. "All set for tomorrow?" I asked, trying to hide my excitement. The thought of leaving behind the stress and routine for warm beaches and fresh ocean air was the only thing keeping me going. Sophia didn't answer right away. She glanced at me, then at her mother, before turning back to her phone. Something felt off. There was a tension in the room, like they were all bracing for something. Finally, she spoke. "Actually, David, we need to talk." My stomach sank. "What is it?" She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Her mother, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly chimed in. "David, we've hit a bit of a situation." "A situation?" I repeated, already feeling the unease creeping in. Sophia sighed, putting her phone down and folding her arms. "The trip. We've had to make some adjustments." "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, my voice steady but tight. "Well," she avoided my gaze, her tone light and dismissive. "You're not coming." It took a moment for her words to sink in. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, the clarification, anything that made this less absurd. "I'm not coming?" I finally managed. "No," she said, still avoiding eye contact. "The thing is, the restaurant's finances have been tighter than expected, and we had to cut back on expenses. It made more sense for you to stay back, to save money." "To save money?" My voice rose slightly. "I already paid my share, Sophia. $3,000, remember? Money I worked double shifts for." "Yes, and that money is helping cover the rest of the expenses," she said, as though that justified everything. "You're doing your part for the family." I felt the blood drain from my face. "My part? You're telling me I worked myself to exhaustion, so you and your family could go to Hawaii without me?" Her mother had the nerve to nod, as if this was the most logical thing in the world. "It's for the greater good, David. You know how much Sophia and Nathan have been stressed lately. This trip is what they need." "What they need?" I said, my voice shaking with disbelief. "What about what I need? I'm your husband, Sophia. Wasn't this supposed to be a family trip? Wasn't this supposed to include me?" Sophia finally looked at me, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by her usual dismissive smirk. "David, don't make this a bigger deal than it is. You can use the time to relax at home. It's not like you'd even enjoy the trip as much as we will." And there it was, the final slap in the face. Not only was I being excluded, but I was being treated as if my presence would somehow diminish their experience. It was as if I didn't even matter. I turned to Sophia's father, hoping for some support, but he avoided my gaze, staring intently at the floor like it held the answer to all of life's problems. Nathan, of course, was useless, scrolling through his phone as if none of this concerned him. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you everything I had to make this happen. I trusted you." Sophia rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, David. It's just a trip. We'll bring you back some souvenirs." That did it. The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the trip. It was about years of being sidelined, ignored, and disrespected. It was about a wife who had chosen her family over her husband time and time again. I stood there, frozen in place, as they carried on as if nothing had happened. Sophia's mother started discussing hotel reservations, her father mentioned something about snorkeling tours, and Nathan muttered something about sunscreen. They didn't even notice when I walked out of the room. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made my decision. This wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. I wasn't going to be the doormat anymore. They had taken my money, my trust, and my dignity, but they weren't going to take my self-respect. The next morning, I played my part perfectly. I smiled and waved as they loaded their suitcases into the car, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was already planning my next move. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd gotten away with it. They had no idea what was coming. When their car finally disappeared down the street, the smile I'd plastered on my face melted away. My hands, still raised in a polite wave, dropped to my sides as the weight of everything hit me. They had done it again. Pushed me aside, dismissed my feelings, and left me with the scraps of their so-called family dynamic. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I took a deep breath, turned on my heel, and walked back into the house that legally belonged to me. For years, I'd let Sophia and her family treat it as their kingdom, with me as nothing more than the caretaker. Not anymore. This house wasn't their playground, and I wasn't their servant. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. I started with their belongings. Sophia's mother had left her knitting bag by the living room sofa, and her father's collection of dusty old books cluttered the shelves. Nathan's video game console, with its tangled mess of cords, sat in the corner, right where he'd abandoned it weeks ago. All of it was going. Every last trace of them. I grabbed some boxes from the garage and got to work. My movements were methodical, almost mechanical, as I packed up their things. I didn't rush, didn't let anger cloud my focus. This wasn't an act of rage. It was an act of reclaiming what was mine. Every item I packed felt like a step closer to freedom. Sophia's designer clothes, which she always insisted on displaying as if they were art pieces, went into one box. Her parents' collection of mismatched dishes, which they'd insisted were heirlooms, went into another. Nathan's endless piles of video games, sneakers, and gym equipment, which he never actually used, filled 3 boxes on their own. As I worked, I found myself noticing things I hadn't seen in years, little remnants of my grandfather's life that had been pushed aside to make room for Sophia's family's clutter. His favorite fishing rod, tucked away in the back of the closet. The old chess set we used to play with, now gathering dust under the coffee table. His framed photos of the lake house where we'd spent countless weekends, hidden behind some hideous modern art Sophia's mother had hung on the walls. I paused for a moment, holding one of those photos in my hands. It was a picture of my grandfather and me on his boat, the sunlight glinting off the water behind us. He had always told me that this house was meant to be a place of peace and happiness. Somewhere along the line, I had let that vision slip away. But not anymore. This was my house, and it was time to honor the legacy my grandfather had left me. Once I had packed up everything that didn't belong to me, I called a moving company. It was Christmas Eve, and I knew it would cost a fortune to get them out here on such short notice, but I didn't care. Whatever the price, it was worth it to get Sophia and her family out of my life for good. The movers arrived within a few hours, their truck rumbling up the driveway like a chariot of justice. I directed them to load everything into the truck and take it to a storage facility on the other side of town. Leave the keys at the front desk, I told them. They can sort it out when they get back. While the movers worked, I made my second call, to a locksmith. I need all the locks changed today, I told him. He hesitated, probably because of the holiday, but I offered to pay double his usual rate. Money didn't matter to me at that moment. What mattered was taking back what was mine. By the time the locksmith arrived, the movers were just finishing up. I watched as the truck pulled away, carrying with it years of resentment, frustration, and disrespect. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. The house was quiet that evening, peaceful, even. For the first time in years, it felt like a home again. I walked through each room, taking in the emptiness. The walls seemed to breathe without the weight of Sophia's family's presence. The air felt lighter, cleaner. I ended the day by sitting on the couch with a beer in one hand and my grandfather's chessboard in the other. I set up the pieces and played a game against myself, just like I used to do when I was a kid. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a reminder that this house was my sanctuary, not theirs. That night, I slept better than I had in years. There were no arguments, no demands, no passive-aggressive comments to haunt me. Just silence and the knowledge that I had finally taken back control of my life. I knew the fallout would come. Sophia and her family wouldn't take this lying down. But as I lay there in the quiet of my newly reclaimed home, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. And no matter what came next, I knew I was ready to face it. I woke up to chaos. My phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, vibrating so violently it nearly fell off the edge. It was barely dawn, but Sophia and her family had clearly discovered what I had done. The screen was a battlefield of missed calls, voicemails, and texts, all demanding explanations. The first message I read was from Sophia. "David, what the hell have you done? We can't get into the house. Where are our things? Call me now." Then came her mother. "David, this is unacceptable. We're family. You've gone too far." Her father's message was even shorter. "Fix this immediately." Nathan, unsurprisingly, didn't bother with words, just an angry string of expletives. I ignored all of them. I made myself a cup of coffee, took a seat at the kitchen table, and watched the sunrise through the window. The house was so peaceful now, so quiet. It was amazing how quickly the tension had dissipated once they were gone. The phone kept buzzing. I picked it up and scrolled through the messages. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. "Sophia, you've ruined Christmas. How could you do this to your wife and your family?" Her mother. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Nathan, "You're dead to me, bro, dead." I set the phone down and laughed to myself. After everything they'd done for me? The sheer audacity of that statement was almost impressive. What exactly had they done, other than take advantage of my kindness and walk all over me for years? By mid-morning, the call started. First Sophia, then her mother, then Sophia again. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages ranged from angry to desperate to guilt-tripping. "David, answer your phone. You can't just throw your family out on the street. You need to fix this right now, or we'll have no choice but to take legal action. This isn't who you are, David. You're better than this." The last one made me pause. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone. Sophia sounded genuinely shaken. For the first time, she wasn't the one in control, and she didn't know how to handle it. I considered calling her back, but I knew what would happen. She'd twist the narrative, make me out to be the villain, and somehow convince me to undo everything I'd done. I wasn't falling for it this time. By early afternoon, the messages turned more frantic. Sophia's family had apparently gone to the house to inspect the damage, only to find the locks changed and their belongings gone. "Sophia, where are our things? You had no right to do this." Her mother, "You need to bring the keys and let us in immediately." "Nathan, you're a coward. Come face us like a man." I smirked at that last one. Nathan had always been quick to throw around insults, but he'd never back them up with action. He was the kind of guy who talked big, but crumbled the second someone stood up to him. I spent the rest of the day ignoring their calls and texts. Instead, I focused on myself. I cleaned the house, rearranged the furniture, and even hung up some of my grandfather's old photos that had been shoved into storage. It felt good, like I was reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost. By evening, the messages took a darker turn. Sophia and her family weren't just angry anymore. They were desperate. "Sophia, David, please. We have nowhere else to go. Just let us back in. We can talk about this." Her mother, "You're tearing this family apart. I hope you can live with yourself." "Nathan, you're a piece of SHD, man. I swear. I'll make you regret this." Asterisk. I sighed and put my phone on silent. Their words didn't hurt me the way they once might have. If anything, they made me feel stronger. For the first time in years, I wasn't bending over backward to accommodate them. I wasn't letting them guilt-trip me into submission. That night, Sophia called again. For some reason, I decided to pick up. "David!" she exclaimed the moment I answered. "Finally!" Why haven't you been answering? Do you have any idea what you've done? I know exactly what I've done, I replied calmly. I've taken back my house and my life. You can't just kick us out like this, she said, her voice trembling. We're your family. No, Sophia, I said firmly. You're not my family. You stopped being my family the moment you chose your lover over me. The moment you let your family disrespect me in my own home. The moment you took my hard-earned money and went to Hawaii without me. She started to argue, but I cut her off. I've spent years putting up with your selfishness, your entitlement, your complete disregard for me as a person. Not anymore. This is my house, Sophia. You and your family are no longer welcome here. There was silence on the other end. Then, finally, she whispered, "You'll regret this." I hung up without another word. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. They could rage and threaten all they wanted, but they no longer had any power over me. After Sophia's call ended, I sat in the quiet of my now empty house, replaying her words in my mind. You'll regret this. She sounded so sure of herself, so certain that I would crumble under the weight of her anger and the expectations of her family. But as I sat there, I realized just how far I'd come. Regret? No. What I felt was liberation. For years, I had tolerated the intolerable. I thought back to the early days of my marriage to Sophia, when I believed that compromise meant sacrificing my own needs for hers. At the time, I told myself it was worth it because that's what love demanded. But love isn't supposed to strip you of your dignity. It isn't supposed to make you feel invisible. Sophia's family had always been a challenge. Her parents, David and Lorraine, had a way of making me feel like an outsider from the very beginning. During the first Thanksgiving I spent with them, Lorraine had looked me up and down and asked, "So, David, what exactly do you bring to the table?" I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just an awkward joke. But now, years later, her words echoed with a sharper meaning. That had been my introduction to their dynamic. Sophia's family at the center, and me as a peripheral figure, tolerated but never truly embraced. Then there was Nathan, Sophia's brother. He was a man perpetually stuck in adolescence, despite being well into his 30s. Jobless, aimless, and completely comfortable sponging off anyone who would let him, Nathan had moved into the house under the guise of temporary circumstances. That temporary stay had stretched into years, with him contributing nothing but complaints and messes. When I'd suggested it was time for him to move out, Sophia had looked at me like I was heartless. "He's family David," she'd said, as if that explained everything. And of course, there was Sophia herself. She had been everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Smart, ambitious, and charming. But beneath the surface was a woman who expected the world to revolve around her. Her ambitions came first, her desires were non-negotiable, and her loyalty was reserved for her family. I was just there, a supporting character in the Sophia show. For years, I had tried to make it work. I had bent over backward to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to prove that I was worthy of their respect. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Every time I stood up for myself, I was met with accusations of selfishness. Every time I expressed frustration, I was told I was overreacting. I became a ghost in my own life, drifting through the days, trying to convince myself that things would get better. The house, my grandfather's house, was the last connection I had to a time when I felt valued. My grandfather had been a man of quiet strength, the kind of person who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. He'd always told me, "David, never let anyone make you feel small. Your worth isn't up for debate." When he passed away and left me the house, I felt like he'd handed me a piece of himself, a reminder to stand tall, even when the world tried to knock me down. But somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that lesson. I let Sophia and her family take over, not just the house, but my life. They turned it into their playground, and I let them. I told myself I was being a good husband, a good son-in-law, a good brother-in-law. But what I really was a doormat. The trip to Hawaii was just the final straw. It wasn't about the money, though losing $3,000 I'd worked tirelessly to save was painful enough. It was about what that money represented. It was a symbol of all the times I'd given and given, only to be taken for granted. When Sophia and her family decided I wasn't worth bringing along, they made it clear how little they valued me. That trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a declaration. I was expendable. Sitting there in the silence of my house, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't drowning in anger or resentment. Instead, I felt free. Free from the endless cycle of trying to earn their approval. Free from the weight of their expectations. Free to finally put myself first. I thought about my grandfather again, about the afternoons we'd spent fishing on the lake. He used to tell me, "David, the best things in life aren't flashy. They're the quiet moments, the ones that remind you who you are." I hadn't understood what he meant back then, but now, it made perfect sense. This house was my quiet moment. It was my sanctuary, and reclaiming it wasn't just about kicking out Sophia and her family. It was about reclaiming myself. For years, I'd let their voices drown out my own. But now, sitting in the stillness of my home, I could finally hear it again. My voice, my worth, my strength. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself. And I knew that no matter what came next, I wasn't going back to the way things were. I had spent enough time living for other people. Now, it was time to start living for me. The fallout didn't stop. My phone buzzed relentlessly, the vibrations rattling against the table like a persistent, unwanted guest. The texts and calls from Sophia, her family, and even mutual friends came in waves, each more aggressive or manipulative than the last. But by now, I had built a wall of resolve. I wasn't budging. Sophia, unsurprisingly, was the loudest. Her texts swung wildly between anger and desperation, as if she couldn't decide whether to berate me or plead for forgiveness. "You've ruined everything, David. We trusted you, and you betrayed us. I can't believe you'd throw your wife and her family out like this. What kind of man does that? David, please. We have nowhere else to go. Can't we at least talk?" Her mother, Lorraine, chimed in with her usual superiority. "David, this is beneath you. Whatever anger you're feeling, you need to let it go. Family is family." And Nathan, ever the charmer, sent a text that almost made me laugh out loud. "You're pathetic, bro. Hope you're proud of yourself." The accusations, the guilt-tripping, the insults. It was all so predictable. For years, they had relied on these tactics to keep me in line. They assumed I would cave, just like I always had. But this time, I wasn't the same man they thought they knew. I didn't respond. Not to the texts, not to the calls, not even to the voicemail Sophia left where she cried about how I was destroying her life. I let their words hang in the air, unanswered. Because here's the thing about people like Sophia and her family. They thrive on control. They need to believe they're in charge, that their words can bend you to their will. Silence, it turns out, is the one thing they can't handle. By the third day, the tone of their messages began to shift. The anger gave way to panic. Sophia sent a string of texts that felt more desperate with each passing hour. "David, please. I'm sorry. Let's just talk this out. We'll do whatever you want. Just let us back into the house. I'll fix this. I promise. Just give me another chance." Her mother even tried a softer approach. "David, I know you're upset, but this isn't the way to handle it. We're family. Let's work this out together." For a brief moment, I considered replying. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to keep the peace, all the times I'd swallowed my pride to avoid conflict. But then I remembered Hawaii. I remembered the way they had laughed and joked as they loaded their luggage into the car, leaving me behind with nothing but broken promises and an empty wallet. I remembered the way Sophia had looked at me, dismissive, condescending, as if I was nothing more than an afterthought. No, I wasn't going back. The turning point came a week later, when the messages stopped altogether. At first, I thought it was a trick, some new ploy to catch me off guard. But then I heard through the grapevine what had happened. Sophia's lover had left her. Apparently, the man she had so carefully hidden from me, the one who had encouraged her to exclude me from the Hawaii trip, had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. He'd cut ties, leaving her to face the mess she created all on her own. The restaurant, which they had touted as their dream venture, was struggling even before the trip. Now, with Sophia distracted and her lover gone, it completely folded. Nathan, ever the opportunist, moved back in with their parents, leaving Sophia to deal with the financial fallout alone. It was ironic, really. For years, they had treated me like I was disposable, like my worth was tied solely to what I could provide. But now, they were the ones being discarded, left to face the consequences of their actions without the safety net they had always taken for granted. I won't lie, part of me felt vindicated. Watching their carefully constructed world fall apart gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about finally seeing the truth for what it was. Sophia and her family had built their lives on the backs of others, on my back. They had taken and taken, without ever giving anything in return. And now, without me to lean on, they were crumbling. I could have stepped in. I could have offered to help, to save them the way they always expected me to. But I didn't, because helping them would have meant sacrificing myself all over again. And I wasn't that man anymore. This wasn't just about reclaiming my house or my money. It was about reclaiming my self-worth. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. And I wasn't about to give that up for anyone, not even Sophia. As I sat on the porch of my house, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the sunset, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The fallout had come and gone, but I was still standing, stronger, wiser, and free. And that was worth more than any trip to Hawaii. The silence was deafening at first. After years of constant noise, Sophia's demands, her family's entitlement, the endless barrage of guilt-tripping texts and calls, being left alone in my own house felt strange. But it was the kind of strange I could get used to. The kind of strange that tasted like freedom. For the first time in years, I had my house, my space, and my life back. The absence of Sophia and her family was like a weight lifted off my chest, and I could finally breathe again. I didn't have to worry about walking into the kitchen to find Nathan's mess sprawled across the counters, or listen to Lorraine's unsolicited critiques of how I managed her daughter's house. It wasn't their house. It was mine. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, it truly felt like home. But as freeing as it was, the quiet also left room for reflection. With Sophia and her family gone, I had to face the person I'd become during those years of neglect and mistreatment. I wasn't proud of how long I'd allowed myself to be a doormat, bending to their will and sacrificing my own needs to keep the peace. It was humbling, but also empowering. Because now, I could finally start focusing on what mattered, me. The first step was securing the house's future. As much as I loved living there, the property taxes and maintenance costs were steep, and I didn't want to end up in the same financial hole Sophia had left me in. So, I reached out to a property management company and began the process of renting it out. They handled everything, screening tenants, collecting rent, and ensuring the house was well maintained. Within a month, I had a reliable couple renting the place, and their monthly payments covered all the expenses with enough left over to start building a decent savings account. With the house rented out, I moved into a small but cozy apartment closer to my workplace. It wasn't as spacious or as grand as my grandfather's house, but it was mine, free from the shadow of Sophia's family. For the first time in years, I had a space that truly felt like my own. No demands, no expectations, just peace. I threw myself into work and started taking on new challenges. Without the constant stress of Sophia's family draining me, I found I had more energy and focus than ever before. Promotions came quickly and before long. I was in a position I had only dreamed of a year ago. It wasn't just about the money, though that was a nice bonus. It was about proving to myself that I could succeed on my own terms. But it wasn't all about work. I made time for the things I had neglected during my marriage, things that brought me joy. I started playing chess again, just like my grandfather had taught me. I joined a local league, and while I wasn't the best player there, the camaraderie and mental challenge were exactly what I needed. I also started hiking, spending weekends exploring trails and reconnecting with nature. There was something deeply healing about standing on a mountaintop, looking out at the world, and realizing just how small my past problems really were. The best part? I began rebuilding relationships with people who truly valued me. Old friends I had drifted away from during my marriage reached out, and I made an effort to reconnect. I also met new people, kind, genuine individuals who appreciated me for who I was, not for what I could provide. For the first time in years, I felt seen and respected. Of course, moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. Sophia's betrayal and her family's mistreatment had left scars, and there were moments when the memories still stung. But those moments became fewer and farther between as I focused on building a life that was truly my own. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sophia and her family were struggling. The restaurant had failed completely, and they were all living under one roof again, trying to figure out their next move. Nathan had apparently gone back to his usual antics, jobless and aimless, and Lorraine was lamenting their misfortune to anyone who would listen. As for Sophia, her lover was gone, and her once carefully curated image of success had crumbled. There was a time when hearing about their struggles would have filled me with anger or satisfaction. But now, all I felt was indifference. Their lives were no longer my concern. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I, on the other hand, was finally living my life on my own terms. Free from their demands and expectations, I had rediscovered who I was and what I wanted. I had built a future I could be proud of, a future that honored the lessons my grandfather had taught me about self-respect and quiet strength. The road to this point hadn't been easy, but it was worth every step. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. And that peace was a gift I would never again take for granted. The silence that followed Sophia and her family's desperate attempts to contact me was more telling than any of their words. Over the weeks, the barrage of texts, calls, and guilt-tripping eventually dwindled to nothing. At first, I thought they were regrouping, crafting some new way to guilt me into submission. But then it hit me. They weren't fighting because they couldn't anymore. I had cut off their access, not just to the house, but to me. And without me as their scapegoat and provider, their manipulative tactics held no power. Through mutual acquaintances, I began to hear bits and pieces of their downfall. Sophia's lover had left her not long after their Hawaii trip, and the restaurant, once their proudest achievement, had completely folded under the strain of poor management and mounting debts. Sophia and her family moved back in with her parents, where they now lived in what could only be described as chaos. Her brother, Nathan, continued his pattern of leeching off anyone who would let him, and Lorraine was now lamenting to anyone who would listen about the cruelty I had shown by evicting them. The version of the story they told painted me as the villain, the cold, ungrateful husband who had abandoned his family in their time of need. At first, I felt a pang of guilt whenever I heard about their struggles. But as I reflected on the years I had spent bending over backward for them, that guilt faded. I wasn't the villain in their story. I was just the first person in their lives who had finally said, enough. What surprised me most was how little I missed them. I used to think cutting ties with Sophia and her family would leave a hole in my life. But the truth was, they had already been absent in all the ways that mattered. They weren't a source of love or support. They were a drain on my energy, my finances, and my peace. Letting them go wasn't a loss. It was a liberation. But estrangement doesn't come without reflection. Late at night, in the quiet of my new apartment, I sometimes found myself thinking about what could have been. What if Sophia had been different? What if she had chosen to prioritize our marriage instead of her family's demands and her own selfish desires? What if her family had respected the boundaries I had tried so hard to set? These thoughts came with a mixture of sadness and clarity. The sadness came from knowing how much potential had been wasted. How a marriage that started with so much promise had turned into something so toxic. But the clarity came from knowing that I had done everything I could. I had given them years of patience, understanding, and sacrifice. I had tried to be the husband, son-in-law, and brother-in-law they needed, only to be met with constant dismissal and entitlement. I wasn't the one who had failed them. They had failed me. And so, I stopped wondering if we would ever reconcile. I stopped hoping for an apology that would never come or a realization on their part that they had been wrong. I didn't need their apologies or their approval anymore. For years, I had sought validation from people who would never give it, and now, I had finally learned to validate myself. That realization was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the moment I understood that I didn't need Sophia's love, her family's acceptance, or their version of forgiveness to move forward. What I needed was what I had already found: my self-respect. Now, as I sit here in my quiet, comfortable apartment, reflecting on everything that has happened, I feel at peace. My grandfather's house is being rented out to a wonderful couple who appreciate it in a way Sophia's family never did. The rental income covers the property taxes and maintenance, with enough left over to build a growing savings account. My career is thriving, my friendships are stronger than ever, and I've even started exploring hobbies I had abandoned during my marriage. Most importantly, I've rediscovered who I am. I'm no longer the man who tiptoes around his own home, afraid to upset people who don't value him. I'm no longer the husband who sacrifices his own happiness to keep someone else's fragile ego intact. I'm no longer the David who was defined by other people's needs and expectations. I'm just me. And for the first time in years, that's enough. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that self-respect isn't something other people can give you. It's something you have to claim for yourself. And sometimes, claiming it means making hard choices, standing up to the people you love, and walking away from the ones who refuse to see your worth. I don't know what the future holds for Sophia and her family, but I do know this: their story is no longer my story. My life is my own now, and I intend to live it fully, freely, and on my terms. And that, more than anything, is the greatest victory of all.